Good afternoon. 6.8% of the United States population suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, within that large cohort is an extremely vulnerable and community of individuals whose prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder is more than double that national average of 6.8%. And there are Iraqi war veterans. The U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs found that 11 to 20% of Iraqi war veterans suffer from PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. With this apparent prevalence and contemporary implications, considering the ongoing situation in Ukraine, there is an urgency surrounding the need to find a more effective solution to PTSD. We propose microdosing psilocybin to assist in the solution. We will begin by establishing the necessary background information, then proposing our methodology, and then discussing the expected results and considerations. We are a team of high school and college student interns in the Leadership Initiative Neuroscience program who are passionate about the advancement and implementation of neuroscience discoveries to enact real change. We have been researching and discussing with international professionals in the clinical and research fields of neuroscience to develop this study. Our research question is, what are the effects of microdosing psilocybin in those specific amounts after 3 weeks on US veterans from the Iraq War who are clinically diagnosed with combat-based PTSD? It is predicted that microdosing this will show a statistically significant decrease in the amygdala hyperactivity as measured by the fMRI bold signals, the DSPS score, the mGlu-R5 receptors activation as measured by a PET scan, and the hippocampal volume as measured by the fMRI voxels. Our aim is to assist in the treatment of veterans by alleviating their symptoms so they can have a better quality of life.
Background information and significance. So the post-traumatic stress disorder is a disorder that occurs in people who have experienced a traumatic event. The disorder is characterized by disturbing thoughts and feelings related to the experience long after it has ended. The symptoms of the PTSD typically include intrusive memories, flashbacks, and nightmares, avoidance of reminders of traumatic events such as people, places, and activities. The people with the PTSD usually have alterations in cognition and mood, to such extent that they may not remember important details of the event, think of themselves and the world negatively, and lose interest in activities previously enjoyed. They also have alterations in arousal and reactivity, are usually irritable, easily startled, overly watchful, and have troubles with concentrating and sleeping. Next slide. The disorder is quite prevalent, and between 11 and 20% of veterans of the Iraq War have the disorder. Next slide. Our study is focused on the effect of psilocybin on participants with disorder. So psilocybin is a psychedelic compound that is produced by many species of mushrooms. And its use changes the consciousness, mood, and perception. But microdoses of psilocybin have a potential to treat mood and anxiety disorders such as PTSD. And of all of the psychedelic drugs, psilocybin is reported to have the most favorable safety profile. Next slide. So our research is aimed to study the effects of microdosing of psilocybin. So microdosing is taking drugs in amounts too small to produce significant alteration in consciousness, but enough to enhance cognitive or emotional processes. For psilocybin, a microdose is generally 1/10 of a full dose. In our studies, the participants will receive a pill of psilocybin every 3 days for 21 days. Next slide. The significance of the study lies in the fact that PTSD is quite a prevalent disorder because in the United States, 6.8% of the population experiences disorder during their lifetime. And although current treatment strategies, which include psychotherapy and medication, are effective in many cases, PTSD is still difficult to treat in many patients. So more research is needed on other possible ways to treat the disorder. And microdosing of psilocybin seems to be a promising way to treat the disorder, to alleviate symptoms, and to improve the quality of life of the patients.
Thank you, Vika. So here are the components of our hypothesis. We predict that a microdose of 0.429 milligrams per 70 kilograms of psilocybin every 3 days for 21 days in combat veterans from the Iraq War that lasted from 2003 to 2011, who are clinically diagnosed with PTSD, will show a significant decrease in amygdala hyperactivity as measured by an fMRI bold signals, a decrease in DSPS score, a decrease in mGLUR5 receptors activation as measured by a PET scan, and hippocampal volume as measured by fMRI voxels when compared to PTSD afflicted veterans given a placebo using a 2-sample t-test. One particular challenge we anticipate with this study is the recruitment of willing participants within our specified pool. The population pool from which we intend to collect participants consists of veterans from the Iraq War who are currently between the ages of 30 and 40. In order to focus the study towards helping the demographic of injured veterans suffering from combat-induced PTSD, we intend to recruit 20 participants based upon the following inclusion criteria. The participants must be male. They must have done at least one tour of duty in Iraq. They must have a clinically administered PTSD scale or CAP scale score of greater than 3. They must have received a Purple Heart. They must not have taken any psychedelics or other drugs in the past. And they must not have received counseling or could have received minimal counseling. A control group of veterans must also be assembled. This group must consist of 10 veterans who received the Purple Heart and who scored 0 on the CAP scale. These veterans must also not have taken any psychedelics or other drugs in the past. As iterated before, recruitment within this population is anticipated to be a particular challenge in this study due to the reluctance of veterans to engage with psychedelic drugs. We believe that a recruitment statement must be issued to neutralize the negative stigma surrounding psilocybin, the drug of choice in this study. This statement, as detailed in our proposal, thoroughly explains what microdosing is, the dosage provided in the study, the effect that psilocybin has been proven to have upon mood and creativity, and the non-existent risk of addiction, as well as the imperceptibility of the drug on the conscious mind. It also specifies the impact the study could have upon their community, such as lowering the rate of veteran homelessness, incarceration, mental illness, and suicide. This statement will be presented to potential participants in the study who are eligible to receive treatment. Once 20 participants are recruited for the treatment groups and 10 participants are randomly selected for the control groups, the 20 participants will be randomly assigned to receive either the placebo sugar pill or a pill containing psilocybin found in the mushroom strain Psilocybe cubensis. Each participant, regardless of their group, will also be assessed using the dissociative subtype of PTSD scale, or DSPS. Following the DSPS scoring, participants will undergo an fMRI scan to identify a baseline measure for the activity in the participant's amygdala. Prior studies indicate that PTSD symptoms such as heightened anxiety correlate with increased hyperactivity in one's amygdala, making it an objective measure of a participant's affliction of PTSD symptoms. An fMRI will also be used to measure the volume of each participant's hippocampus. Previous literature states that increased severity of PTSD symptoms correlate to a smaller hippocampal volume, regardless of the irrelevance of size with relation to neurological pathology. This will also be done in order to identify a relationship between hippocampal volume and PTSD symptom severity. Finally, through the use of positron emission tomography or PET scans, studies conducted at Yale University on animal subjects indicate that increased activation of mGlur5 receptors, or which are a subtype of glutamate receptors in the central nervous system, is directly correlated to fear and anxiety behavior seen in PTSD, suggesting that mGlur5 is an objective measure of PTSD severity. Following the collection of baseline measurements, the randomly selected groups of PTSD-afflicted veterans, will receive either a pill containing psilocybin or a sugar pill. Each group will ingest the mushrooms before their first meal of the day, every 3 days for 21 days. The control group of non-afflicted veterans will not receive treatment or placebo. During the treatment phase, participants, including the control group, will refrain from ingesting additional medication or receiving external counseling. To analyze these results, a 2-sample t-test for statistical significance will be conducted between each group's pre-treatment and post-treatment data.
All right, thank you, Sarah. Onwards, we'll go and talk about our results, considerations, limitations, and implications. Next slide. In our results, we expect to see a few changes. And for one, we expect to see a reduced hyperactivity in the amygdala. As previous studies have shown PTSD to be correlated with an overactive amygdala, creating overwhelming emotional responses, we expect to see these mitigated by psilocybin's neurophysiological effects. With that, we expect there to be a lower activation rate in mGlur5. Increased levels of mGlur5, this receptor, have been shown in mesolimbic areas of those who express PTSD symptoms. Reducing the sensitivity of these receptors, we will then reduce function, which will ultimately reduce symptoms. We also are expecting a possible minor trend in hippocampi size between the two groups, as previous studies have shown there is a smaller hippocampus volume in those who have PTSD compared to those who do not. Next slide. We will encounter some obstacles in this study. Our most difficult problem is leveling out the specific parameters we have put in place and the recruitment process of these veterans. Our parameters are very specific. However, we did find it necessary in order to make sure our results are both reliable and valid. As per se, from the Iraq War, the age limit, the Purple Heart, we want to make sure that everything is combat-based. They all have a traumatic experience with an injury. It should be known that this can be replicated with groups such as ours. It just may be challenging to meet every requirement in the search process. Another large limitation is public opinion on experimental treatments similar to this. We cannot predict the reaction to a study such as this, giving psychedelics to veterans. However, previous studies have shown promising results, and we now have the technology to have careful and precise methods to ensure safety of our participants. Next slide. PTSD is a debilitating disorder and still affects even Vietnam War veterans from decades ago. Noted that I put Vietnam War because I want to make a point that this disease can last forever. With depressive disorders such as these, it is very hard for these people to re-ingratiate in society. It's why you see so many homeless veterans on the street. With the treatment as simple as a pill, it could be a new era of modern treatment in treating cognitive disorders, and with a naturally occurring substance as well. This type of treatment could open the doors to experimenting and treating other disorders as well, many of which veterans suffer from, such as addiction, anxiety, depression, OCD, and schizophrenia. Next slide. So for ethical considerations, we know there are a few important issues to face with this type of experimentation. However, we can at least say with the matter of a minute dose in the substance used, the risks are minimal in terms of physiological reaction. Additionally, the treatment itself is a non-invasive treatment, as it's just a pill that can be taken. However, the PET scan will require an intravenous injection of the radioactive dye. This research has to be wary of the trauma many of these participants have faced, and we are prepared to make accommodations to make sure all participants feel comfortable during the process. In order to treat complex mental disorders, more innovative approaches must be considered as we accelerate in medicine. Thus, we may see studies like these in the future.
These are our references, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
First of all, let me just say this was amazingly good. I mean, for three reasons. Number one, because you guys took the initial commentary based upon your proposal and then really refined it. And if this were actually a grant proposal, if this were a pitch for a grant, you would have gotten the money. And the reason for it is when the reviewer or when the program officer says, hey, listen, I like what you're doing, but you might want to do this, this, and this. And then you do that, but not only do that exceptionally, characteristically, that's what's going to get you a positive pink sheet. In other words, that's what's going to get you, yeah, they did exactly as I wanted them to do based upon their initial idea, which was great. But then they went really down, not into the rabbit hole, but into the rabbit hole with specific detail. So you gimbaled perfectly from your initial presentation in terms of what needed to be done with this to bring this over what I would consider to be the apex of refinement. Outstanding job, point number one. Point number two, this is very, very critical. And I want to recommend that you look something up online. Look up Veterans of War. It's an organization that sponsors just this type of work, taking veterans who have failed other treatments, particularly for PTSD, whether it's with agitated depression or with a longstanding depressive episode, and putting them in touch with various resources, inclusive, for example, of field trips directly down to South America to go through an ayahuasca ceremony, and then quantifying and qualifying the results longitudinally. The reason I say that is that if this is something you're really interested in, that's a group that does it. And the guy who runs it, somebody who I name is Wiley Gray, great guy, former Marine, Semper Fi, tell him I sent you, excellent guy. Third point is that this is really perfect, particularly at that last part where you sort of said, this is not something that is just appropriate to Operation Iraqi Freedom or Enduring Freedom, et cetera, but may also be retroactively viable for those individuals who have failed prior treatments or for whom recurrent PTSD represents an intractable problem and therefore is denigrating the quality of life. So the applicability of this, not only currently, but retrospectively and then perhaps prospectively, is outstanding, as was the use of multiple techniques. I mean, the idea of utilizing radioisotope tracing, for example, to actually assess glutamate binding, outstanding job. The one tiny consideration I have for you, and it's not something that you would even know, right, is I would change the criteria of having gotten a Purple Heart to having been wounded in action. And there's a reason for that. Three things. Number one, it allows you to actually qualify and quantify the extent of the wound. The other thing that allows you to do is say, all right, not necessarily anyone with a heinous wound, in other words, with an amputated wound or with a disfiguring wound, need necessarily incur PTSD. So the wound itself. But the other thing I think is important is that it also opens up perhaps the window of individuals who may have had emotional and or, quote, moral wounds for which they don't award a Purple Heart. And what we're learning is that those psychological trauma, those moral and emotional wounds can be just as, if not more devastating than individuals who receive physical wounds, because very often those are the individuals who don't seek those levels of intervention because there's still a stigma or bias associated with that. So although I don't disagree with the Purple Heart as being sort of a nice capture for that initial round, what you may want to do is either, as I said, modify that to be individuals who have been wounded by self-report, medical report, or whatever, or do a second study. In other words, it says, all right, not only these individuals who are Purple Heart awarded, but those individuals who are also reporting some exposure to trauma and or some form of other type of stressor that they felt was problematic to them. As with others, I commend each and every part of what it is that you did, cohesive, integrative, outstanding. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to take a look at your slides and perhaps work with your group lead together with Morgan, because I think this is something we could develop into two things. Number one, a very, very important speculative paper, particularly a governmental white paper. As you guys may or may not know, I'm currently sitting on a Pentagon commission that examines longitudinal treatment for individuals who want to stay on active duty. and then the use of experimental interventions inclusive of what was formerly illicit drugs within a well-controlled circumstance to be able to keep these people on active duty. This is very useful for that. And the second one is a speculative paper for the open peer literature. And so I think that this might have real great potential, which would of course then involve you as authors. Overall, what that really just says is, I think this was great. I thought you were great. I loved it. Spot on. Overall, bravo Zulu to all.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Dr. Giordano. And next, let's go to Mr. DeFranco.
Yeah, this is a fantastic project. And Dr. Giordano, I think, is holding back some excitement because not only is he a veteran, but way, and I think he's going to be mad at me for how many ways I'm using, but way back in the day, he did some basic science bench research on psychedelic drugs. So he's spinning in that chair over there, and he's going to get me for this later. But this is an incredibly timely protocol because so I live in Colorado currently, and Denver is one of the few cities that have decriminalized psilocybin to be grown by everybody. So it's now opening the floodgates for incredibly significant and interesting proposals like this one is. The one thing I would say is, using veterans for this study is a fantastic idea. And I think you might be limiting yourself by saying Iraqi war veterans, because the Iraqi war was from 2003 to 2010, 2011, somewhere during Obama's first term, right, Dr. G? Yeah, okay. He's giving me the nod. So what that's saying is that when you're treating those veterans now, you're giving yourself about a decade-long span that this condition might have gotten worse. Something, I think this is initial proposal of treating veterans is a fantastic, but if you take a step back and just, maybe a more holistic clinical proposal is looking at public servants like police officers and getting, treating police officers right after a traumatic event. So a couple of days, couple of weeks, couple of months, and then comparing that to treating, after a couple of years and possibly after a couple of decades. And you'll give, different conditions where you can compare the efficacy of this microdosing treatment, which I think is an outstanding approach to an alternative medicine that we've been overlooking for decades now. So this, like Dr. G said, this proposal has a ton of, credibility. I think it's absolutely fundable, and you should take him up on his offer about putting this into a government white paper, because academic journals are great, but government white papers actually get read with people with a lot of money in their pockets. So I applaud you guys for this presentation.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And now to Ms. Lovelace.
Fantastic work. Beautiful slide presentation. Excellent use of design to organize your materials and help guide the flow of your information. I like to see just a few font adjustments for legibility, but overall the information was presented clearly, concisely. Your transitions and timing were great, and everyone gave a really engaging and professional level presentation. Very well done.
All right, and Ms. Thompson.
Bringing up the rear. First of all, guys, you get bonus points for going last. Never an easy position to be in. I loved this. I thought this was so strong, very clearly presented, very well organized. You had a hook right up front. That very first slide that you were on, you told us exactly what you were going to, you told us what you were going to tell us from that very first slide. You gave us statistics that put it in context. You told us 6.8% of the population suffers from PTSD, and that it's more than double that for veterans. Right off the bat, you've got my interest. This is a big issue. You put this in context for me. Then you went on to explain the social implications. These are things we just talked about with the last group, why that's important when you're presenting this to an audience. You don't know exactly who's going to be in your audience, who's coming from the government, who's scientific, who's man on the street. You pulled us all in right off the bat. I thought your methodology was clear, your purpose was clear, your study, the context, the expected results, everything was crystal clear. I think the only thing I would suggest is when you're doing the actual slide presentation, pop that into presentation mode, because we were looking at sort of a reduced screen. I was having a little trouble seeing the actual slides, but I thought you all contributed fantastically. There was a great deal of work that went into this. You were all very professional. You all spoke well. And I echo what Mr. DeFranco said, take Dr. Giordano up on his offer. There's real social benefit to what you're studying here.